Hello and welcome to my course, Economics for Business. This is the last module, module number 7, and it's caveats of economic data. So a quote I like to remember when working with any statistics or data is that statistics are like bikinis. What they reveal is suggestive, but what they conceal is vital. That's by Aaron Levinstein, who's an economist and business professor. So there's two kind of objectives for this final module. Basically, I want you to understand several of kind of the most prominent caveats that are common to all economic data. But then I also want to reiterate that really you can use the data no matter what the caveats are, because if you have some context, then you can make the data useful. As long as you kind of remember the caveats, and if you're publishing anything, remember to cite the caveats. So let's go through some caveats together. So common to kind of all economic data is that economic data usually isn't created primarily for you. It's really a policy instrument, it's a policy tool. Especially GDP, unemployment and inflation data. These data points are kind of published and created for policymakers. And so they have kind of very specific purposes. When GDP is increasing fast or decreasing fast, then that tells policymakers to either change something in some way or gives them kind of the green light to introduce a new program or a new policy. When unemployment is increasing and inflation is decreasing, then that gives policymakers and central banks kind of a bit of a green light, a bit of permission to decrease the overnight bank rate or the official cash rate or whatever that interest rate is called in the country you're looking at. But really, I'm just reiterating that these statistics are created for policymakers, but that doesn't mean that they are not useful for you. So I guess the other second big caveat, kind of common to all economic data, is that there's a time lag between when the data relates to and when it's published. So for example, the New Zealand GDP statistic for September 2024 will be released on the 19th of December 2024. That's about 3 months from when kind of the statistic kind of relates, because the September GDP statistic is supposed to be describing what happened to the economy in July, August and September of 2024, but it's not released until December 2024. So that's, it limits its usefulness a little bit. And as long as we understand why that is, then we can kind of work with that. And kind of a more extreme example is census data. In New Zealand, from experience, our census data usually takes around 1.5, kind of 2 years to go from collection to release. And this is all caused by the fact that these statistics are created by either sending out a lot of surveys or collecting a lot of primary data in some way. Then all that data is brought into a central server. A team is set on the data to clean it, process it in some way, and then they want to analyze it internally. They want to make sure the data doesn't reveal any private information of individuals. And all of this takes time, and so understandably, if all these things take time, there's going to be a time lag between when the statistic relates to and when it's actually released. So I want to go through some caveats kind of for specific data points that we have talked about in Module 4. So if you remember in Module 4 we talked about the gross domestic product, and I gave you the idea that this statistic is useful for kind of contextually saying, how is the economy doing? It's a vibe check on everything, right? But, when you kind of dig into this, or when you might see some other economic reports, they might use this statistic to measure the income of the economy. But that's it's not incorrect, it's correct in a certain way of thinking. But really, if we're being very robust, then really this statistic measures consumption. It's defined as measuring consumption. The second statistic I want to talk about is the Consumer Price Index. And we saw this in Module 4 as well. We talked about how the statistic is created. It's a survey is sent around to different shops, and different surveyors go around different shops and collect the prices of different goods. And then those prices are all added together and a weighted average is calculated. So really the way I remember the caveat for this data is that it measures the average rate of change in the average prices for an average basket of goods for an average consumer. So it's an average of averages of averages. It's not intended to be exact. As I said, it's a policy variable. And basically, you can't make it exact. The more you try and make this measure exact, the more you undermine its usefulness, because you will end up measuring only the price changes in one good, and that would be an exact measure, but it would not be a measure that you need. And finally, we've seen unemployment measures too. So we saw in Module 4 that I kind of went through around 4 different ways of measuring unemployment, and every country uses a slightly different definition, but every definition is subjective. Common to all of the definitions is this idea that someone to be unemployed needs to be not working, they need to be available for work, and they need to be actively looking for work. So all of these kind of factors in the definition are already subjective, and statistical agencies do their best to kind of get around this subjectivity by asking their surveys in certain ways. They might ask the same question several different ways, or they might ask several different questions to try and tease out that subjectivity and get rid of it in terms of the subjectivity from the survey respondent's perspective. But actually the questions they ask are also subjective. So we're never going to get a measure of unemployment that measures kind of this idea of true unemployment. There'll always be some subjectivity in what makes a person unemployed. And remember in Module 4 I said that this statistic is a vibe check, because being unemployed sucks, really. And so if unemployment is high, then that's going to be bad, kind of quite unambiguously. And so I guess if you just remember that it is subjective, and it's impossible to make it not subjective. And finally, I want to go through some kind of key lessons that I've learned kind of practicing economics over the last decade or so. The first is that correlation does not imply causation. So in statistics, we would call this the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, and that just simply means in Latin, after this, therefore because of this. And that's a common fallacy made by many different researchers over time. But in economic data and in economic data series, just because you see a movement in one series before a movement in another series, that doesn't mean there's a causal relationship. And equally, if two data series move instead of one before the other, if they move both at the same time, again, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a relationship. But you can unpick the statistical relationship with some really advanced statistical techniques. And I want to go through an example of this. Not the advanced statistical techniques, I'll take you through a kind of visual example. So I've made up some data here. This is a completely made up country. So for this country, they had some really strong GDP growth. The economy was doing well. People were pretty happy, going up to about 2008. And then they went through a severe economic depression. And then that kind of recovered in sort of 2012, 2013, and things were good again. And then in terms of unemployment, in this economy, things started off kind of a little bit rough, right? 5% unemployment isn't historically high, but certainly in my context in New Zealand, definitely within the last kind of 2 decades, 5% unemployment has been quite high for us, and that's quite that is an anomaly historically. But you can see kind of contextually things change. And then we go through this period. It's good here, and yeah, it's also good here. People are vibing, man. Like people are getting jobs. It's good times. And then you see in 2008, it's still pretty good. But then 2008 comes to an end, 2009, and unemployment spikes. And that kind of happens after we said the depression happens, right? So we might conclude, if we're kind of being a bit naive, we might say that this GDP caused unemployment to increase. And no, that's not quite right. Actually, we should go into what caused the change in GDP. So we don't know what that is because this is pretend data, but let's say it was a financial crisis. Just like in the real world, we had the global financial crisis during 2008, after the subprime mortgage bubble kind of burst. And so that could have been the case in this made-up world too. Maybe a subprime mortgage bubble burst here, and so the GDP statistic crashed, and then a little bit after that, the unemployment rate rose. And so then we could say that causally, that bubble bursting caused both the GDP to decrease and the unemployment to rise. But we still can't say that the GDP caused the unemployment. And another lesson is that you should never reason from a price change. So we've been looking at barley prices with the Great Beer Guys case study, and we've seen that the barley prices kind of were a bit stable, and they spiked in 2021, and then they went down again. And it is kind of tempting to say, oh, okay, we see this spike in 2021, we can kind of reason from that something changed. That's kind of the wrong way around. So prices in general can change for two reasons. Either the supply has changed or demand has changed. But the price change that we see in the statistics can't tell us which of those is true. And so you need some context before you draw any inference from the change. So if you remember back to when I showed you that graph of barley prices, and I talked about the rapid increase in barley prices after 2021, well, I know from my previous research and kind of the context that I understand, I know that price change relates to a period when barley supply was severely constrained because of the supply of shipping containers. There was kind of a shipping container crisis at that time point. And so I can say with some confidence that the change in prices that we saw was probably caused by a change in supply. But again, I needed context to draw that conclusion. I could not draw that straight from the data. And the final lesson, this I guess is the most important lesson, always be skeptical. So every statistic or every piece of data from every different source will always come with its own caveats, it will always come with its own assumptions. The official statistics agencies, the Bureau of Labour Statistics, the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Statistics New Zealand, as well as many others, they all publish methodology papers where they publish in really great detail how they calculate the statistics, how the source data is collected and curated. They take you through all the formulae that they use, and they're really transparent about how these things are created before they're published. So it's a good idea to read those reports. It's a good idea to download them and save them for later. And if you find some data kind of out in the wild, by out in the wild I mean if you're looking at some data that someone from who's not in a statistical agency, they reported in an economic report that you might get from a economics consultancy, or you might see some data that someone posts on LinkedIn who is a researcher of some sort. See if you can track down the data to its official source, and if you can't, then hopefully the person who's publishing that data has noted, this is the base data might be sourced from somewhere, but then I've kind of made some modifications. So in my experience, when I've done this, I always publish whatever I've done, the model, the results, the analysis, and then I always source the data. And if I have made a model and made some changes to the data, I'll always write down my methodology and my assumptions. And hopefully the researcher you find will be kind of amenable to an email question. But they don't have to be, so be careful of that. So kind of a summary for this module. All statistics have caveats. And common to all of them is the idea there's a time lag between the period to which they relate and the period when they're published. GDP measures consumption, not income. The CPI is inexact, and kind of any attempts to make it exact kind of undermine its usefulness. And unemployment will kind of always be subjective. Will always be a subjective measure. And then some key lessons that I've learned. Correlation does not imply causation, but there are ways to kind of tease out causation from correlation if you understand statistics, and you can kind of do the maths. You should never reason from a price change, and you should always be skeptical. Don't trust, verify. So I guess that's the end of the course. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have any questions about the course, or any questions that the course has kind of sprung in your mind, feel free to post them on the official forums, the school forums, and I look forward to seeing you in my next course.